Welcome to my channel. I'm Nancy Miller, your storyteller of American folk tales, thrilling mysteries, and all sorts of intriguing topics. Join me for today's tale. It was a late night in the early days of the American frontier, around the 1700s. A young servant girl named Clara was starving. She was scrubbing piles of laundry in the washroom of a grand estate. All this because she'd been helping the young mistress, Miss Honor, primp and preen, only to accidentally nick her with a hairpin. That little mistake showed just how harsh her world could be. Clara was born in a small mountain hamlet, tucked away in the Appalachians. Her family wasn't rich by any stretch, but she'd had a joyful childhood. That is, until she turned 11. A terrible flood swept through her hometown. Her parents didn't make it. Poor Clara was left reeling. Losing her loved ones was bad enough, but now she had to figure out how to survive. Orphaned, she had no choice but to stick with the other survivors from her village, distant kin or neighbors, who'd also lost everything. They turned to begging just to scrape by. But with so many desperate folks, they couldn't all beg together. Soon enough, Clara and the others scattered, drifting apart. She wandered from place to place, piecing together a meal here and there. The future? Hope. She had no idea where to find either. One day, Clara was begging in a dusty little town along the frontier. A wealthy man with a kind face spotted her. He handed her a hearty chunk of bread and some dried meat. Then he gently asked about her situation. Clara told him everything, her whole sad story. The rich man sighed. "Poor kid," he said. "You've really been through it." He introduced himself as Mr. Lucius, a well-liked figure in town. "There are too many kids like you out here," he added. "Come with me if you want. I'll make sure you've got food in your belly and warm clothes on your back." Clara didn't think twice. She followed the rich man. But Mr. Lucius wasn't what he seemed. He ran a sort of boarding house, one just for orphans. When those kids grew up, he'd size up their looks and skills. The pretty ones got married off as second wives to rich men. The plain ones were sold as maids. Some ended up in the rough saloons out west, places full of gamblers and drifters. Clara wanted out of that trap. She tried to run once, but they caught her and beat her senseless. They locked her in a dark cellar, starving her for 3 days straight. She nearly died. After that, she gave up on escaping. All she could do was quietly pray she wouldn't end up in one of those saloon towns. Clara had a natural beauty, bright eyes and a sweet face. A real looker. Years passed, and soon she was set to be shipped off to a saloon in a big trading post. Clara was terrified. She couldn't sleep at night. She'd cry into her pillow, muffling the sound. Early one morning the housemother, an old hag who worked for Lucius, shook her awake. "Get up and get dressed," the woman barked. "You're heading to the trading post to live the good life." But when she got a good look at Clara, she shrieked. "Clara, what in blazes happened to your face? Did you mess yourself up on purpose so you wouldn't have to go?" Clara grabbed a dented tin mirror and peeked. She flinched at what she saw. Half her face was covered with a dark, ugly birthmark. It looked downright spooky. She scrubbed at it with a rag. Nothing happened. The housemother yelled for water, making Clara wash again. Still nothing. The old woman wouldn't quit. She hauled in a frontier dock. But the doctor just shrugged and said Clara was fine otherwise. As for the birthmark, he had no clue what caused it. Clara might have looked hideous now, but deep down, she was relieved. Could it be her prayers had been answered? But the housemother wasn't about to let years of feeding and raising her go to waste. She beat Clara again, then started hunting for a buyer anyway. After hearing about Clara's new look though, no one wanted her. Until, at last, someone stepped up. So why'd this fella buy Clara? It wasn't out of pity, that's for sure. There was another reason altogether. Turns out, the buyer was a man named Frank Wheeler, who'd come from nothing. His wife died young, leaving him with just one daughter, Pearl. They'd scraped by on odd jobs until, by some stroke of luck, Frank struck it rich overnight. He became a big shot, known around town as Mr. Wheeler. With his newfound wealth, Mr. Wheeler started living large. He took on a string of young wives, hoping for sons to carry on his name and inherit his sprawling fortune. But things didn't go as planned. None of those wives gave him the boys he wanted. So he poured all his doting into his only daughter, Pearl, his little treasure. Pearl had it rough growing up with her pa. She'd nearly been pushed to the edge by him more than once. Back when they were dirt poor, Frank had dragged her to a cliff, ready to end it all. But when the money rolled in, she went from a ragged kid to a pampered princess overnight. Her father's indulgence turned her spoiled and bratty. Pearl was a beauty, no doubt about it, but she loved showing off. Folks around her showered her with praise, and she started thinking she was some kind of angel. Full of herself, she strutted through town. Until one day, someone whispered that she wasn't even as pretty as the maid trailing behind her. Pearl flew into a rage. She fired every servant girl she had and sold them off cheap. She wanted a new maid, one uglier than sin, to make her look even better by comparison. And Clara, with that awful birthmark, was the perfect pick. Once Clara arrived at the Wheeler estate, she became the butt of everyone's jokes. Every day was a grind, endless chores piled on her shoulders. Pearl, being the spoiled tyrant she was impossible to please. One tiny slip-up, and she'd scream at Clara or slap her around. Sometimes she wouldn't even let Clara eat. But Clara was tough. She had a spark of optimism that wouldn't quit. She figured, as a frail girl who'd made it this far, just being alive was something to be grateful for. Anything beat ending up in one of those saloon towns. If the heavens had seen fit to slap that birthmark on her face, she reckoned it was for a reason. She trusted that things would turn around someday. Clara hadn't been at the Wheeler place long when the family's business started tanking. Deal after deal went sour, and Mr. Wheeler moped around, sighing all day. He couldn't figure out what was going wrong. That night at supper, one of his young wives piped up, trying to butter him up. "Sir," she said, "I reckon I know what's causing this mess. It's gotta be Clara. That girl's a walking jinx. I heard she lost her folks young, then got picked up by that Lucius fella. She was a real beauty at first, supposed to fetch a pretty penny. But right before they shipped her off, that ugly mark showed up on her face. That's when she got dumped on us. Ever since she got here, our luck's been rotten. She must have brought some bad mojo and wrecked the harmony of this house. What do you think, sir?" Mr. Wheeler nodded, buying her story hook, line, and sinker. He was about to call the housekeeper to sell Clara off again when a servant burst in. "Sir," the boy panted. "There's a man at the gate, says he's an old friend. Claims he's here to help you dodge a disaster." Mr. Wheeler perked up, grasping at straws. He hustled out to the front yard to meet this so-called savior. Out in the yard, Mr. Wheeler spotted the man, a grizzled figure with a sly grin. "Well, well, Frank," the stranger said. "Been a while, huh? Thought you'd forgotten your old pal." His name was Levi Stone, a wandering fortune-teller with a limp and a sharp eye. Levi's face darkened as he cut to the chase. "Seems you've been too high and mighty lately, Frank. 3 years back, I came looking for you. You brushed me off with a dozen excuses. If I've got this right, you're in a heap of trouble now, ain't you?" Mr. Wheeler froze. Levi had hit the nail on the head, and Frank couldn't ignore him this time. He ushered Levi straight to his study for a private talk. So what was the secret between these two? Turns out, Frank Wheeler grew up in a rundown shack not far from Clara's old village. His folks were poor as dirt, scraping by on whatever they could save. They'd pooled every penny to get him hitched, hoping he'd settle into a quiet life. But Frank had bigger dreams, too big for his britches. He wanted to strike it rich, quick. He borrowed cash left and right and headed to town to try his luck in trade. Less than a year later, he'd blown it all, the loans, his savings, everything. Desperate to claw his way back, he ignored his sickly parents, who needed a doctor bad. He even bullied his wife into begging her folks for more money. She pleaded with him to tend to his ma and pa first, to keep the family afloat. But Frank snapped. "If you won't get that cash, don't bother coming back." When she hesitated, he laid into her, beat her black and blue. "Worthless," he yelled, furious she wouldn't bend. His parents, neglected and untreated, didn't last long. They were gone within months. His wife took off too, leaving him with regrets and little Pearl. Frank tried to raise his daughter right, swearing to do better. But then the creditors came knocking. Penniless and cornered, Frank grabbed Pearl and headed for a cliff out back. He was ready to jump. Just then, Levi Stone happened by. He couldn't stand by and watch two lives end like that. Levi rushed over. Frank, what's got you so low you do this? Frank spilled his guts. Well, most of them. He spun a yarn about being a decent man ruined by bad business. Said his wife died of sickness, 'cause he couldn't afford medicine. Claimed he felt so guilty, and with the debts piling up, he figured he'd take Pearl and join his wife in the grave. Levi listened, his heart softening. They talked a spell, and Levi asked for Frank's birth date. He sighed. Looks like you're doomed to scrape by forever, friend. But. Frank's eyes lit up at that, but. He cut Levi off. But what, Levi? If you've got a way to make me rich, I'll do anything, anything. Levi leaned in. I found a spot, a piece of land with good fortune buried in it. It's a woman's luck, not a man's. Your wife's gone, so that fits. Bury her there, and I swear you'll hit the jackpot. Thing is, meddling with fate's got a cost. I'll pay it, but I don't know how steep. I've got 2 conditions if you want my help. Levi, Frank said, practically drooling, if you can make me rich, I'd agree to 100 terms, let alone 2. Naming. First, Levi said, when you strike it rich, half your haul's mine. Second, you'll marry Pearl off to me when she's grown, so I can live easy in my old age. No deal otherwise. Frank paused, then grinned. Deal. I swear it. Levi took him to the lucky spot. Frank didn't waste a second. Following Levi's jittery instructions, they set up a crude burial marker. A bolt of lightning cracked the sky, striking Levi square. He survived, but it busted his leg. Levi hobbled off, hollering at Frank to remember the promise. Frank waved him off, heading home with Pearl, a woodcutting axe in hand. Back home, Frank grabbed his axe and headed into the woods with Pearl. He figured he'd chop some firewood, maybe pick some wild berries to tide them over. He'd sell the wood by the river later for a few coins worth of grub. All he could do was wait for that promised windfall. Frank hacked away at the trees, head down. Not long after, Pearl was playing nearby. He glanced around, making sure she was safe. Suddenly, he heard her scream for help. Frank dropped the axe and ran. He found Pearl stuck in a shallow pit. He yanked her out quick, asking if she was hurt. I'm okay, Pearl said, but my foot hit something hard down there. It stings. Curious, Frank climbed into the hole. He couldn't believe his eyes. There was a big weathered rock chest poking out of the dirt. He grabbed his axe and started digging around it, prying the chest open. When he cracked it, his jaw dropped, nearly popped out of his skull. Inside was a haul of gold coins and glittering jewelry. With that treasure, Frank cashed in for a whopping $5,000. He paid off his debts, then strutted around town, showing off to all the kin and pals who'd once looked down on him. He took Pearl and moved to the nearest bustling county seat. For the first time, Frank had real money, more than he knew what to do with. But he wasn't dumb enough to just burn through it. He wanted to invest, turn his luck into a lasting fortune. What kind of business, though? Lucky for him, he bumped into an old buddy while strolling through town. When the friend heard about Frank's turnaround, he chuckled. There's a big family in town fixing to move out, he said. They're selling their house and store dirt cheap. The caretaker's a cousin of mine. Slip him a little something, and he'll smooth the deal for you. Beats starting from scratch. What do you say? Frank didn't hesitate. Sounds perfect. And just like that, he bought the family's property, house, store, and all. His business took off, doubling his wealth in no time. But that promise he made to Levi? Frank shoved it clean out of his mind, lost in his new life of luxury. 3 years back, Levi tracked him down, demanding his cut, half the fortune, and Pearl's hand when she came of age. Frank, greedy as ever, couldn't stand parting with a dime. Giving up half his cash felt like carving out his own heart. And Pearl? She was too full of herself, dreaming of marrying some fancy gentleman and living like a lady. No way she'd settle for a limping old coot like Levi. She threw a fit in the backyard, threatening to run off or worse. So Frank flat out refused Levi's claims. They argued hot and heavy in the study. Levi fumed. If it weren't for me finding that lucky spot, you'd have nothing today. I paid a price for you, lost my leg. How can you go back on your word? Frank shot back, you call it a lucky spot? Pearl fell in that hole and found the loot herself. I got rich off my own dumb luck, not you. You pulled us off that cliff, sure. Here's $100 for your trouble. Take it and get. Don't come preaching gratitude at me again, or you'll regret it. Levi glared, snatched the money, and stormed out, chased off by Frank's hired hands. Now though, Frank's business was crumbling fast. If it didn't turn around, he'd be bankrupt. He couldn't stomach going back to the poorhouse after tasting the high life. So he swallowed his pride and welcomed Levi into the study. Levi, he said, all sugar and smiles, if you can pull me out of this mess, we can talk terms, anything you want. Levi smirked. Should have listened sooner, huh? Back then, I left out one detail on purpose. That lucky spot? It's only good for 10 years. Time's up, and now you're sinking. Unless. Frank jumped on it like a dog on a bone. Unless what, Levi? Quit dangling it, I'm desperate here. Levi leaned back, savoring the moment. Unless you find another lucky spot, he said, and a girl with the right stars in her chart. She's got to be a natural beauty, with clear, honest eyes. You use her eyes as an offering to lock in the fortune. That'll keep your business humming for decades. Frank blinked, stunned. Levi, that's downright murder. Who'd give up their eyes for that? But Levi just shrugged. Ain't no other way, Frank. Frank squinted at him. Hold on, you ain't sore, 'cause I wouldn't marry Pearl to you, are you? Trying to trick me into hurting my own girl? I don't know squat about star charts anyway. Levi shook his head. You're overthinking it. Pearl's no natural beauty, too tart up. I just want my half of the cash, or say, $5,000. That's my price. Levi was asking for the moon, but Frank was in too deep to haggle. Where do I find this girl with the right stars? He pressed. Levi grinned. You've already got her, right here in your house. Frank waved a hand. In my house? Nonsense. Any girl with a lick of looks, Pearl's run off already. Levi lowered his voice. What about Clara? Frank shook his head like a drum. Her? She gives me the creeps every time I see her. Told her to stay out of my sight. She's a walking curse, I was about to sell her off. She's no curse, Levi said. She's your lucky star. Before that mark showed up, she was a stunner. And we don't need her face, just her eyes. Frank mulled it over. It made a twisted kind of sense. Clara was just a maid, nobody important. He nodded slowly. Levi's grin widened. That night, Frank and Levi hashed out their plan in the study, long past midnight. Frank called over a hired hand standing watch outside. Round up a couple boys, he whispered. Sneak out back and grab Clara, quiet-like. Bring her to me and Levi. We'll handle the rest. Clara, meanwhile, was in the washroom out back. Pearl had chewed her out earlier, so she was stuck scrubbing clothes late. She was bone-tired and hungry. She stood up to stretch, figuring she'd slip off to the outhouse. Then she heard voices, Frank's men talking to the housekeeper. Clara's heart skipped. Why were they up this late, whispering like that? Were they plotting something shady? She decided it was none of her business and turned to get back to work. But then she caught her name in their chatter. Clara froze, ears perked. Keep it down, one man hissed. Don't blame me for waking you this late, boss's orders. Where's Clara? She ain't in her room. The housekeeper grumbled, this hour? What's the boss want with her now? The hired hand muttered, it's those clear eyes of hers. The fortune teller and the boss reckon they'll use 'em to fix the house's luck. Good Lord, the housekeeper gasped. That's pure evil. Poor Clara's slaving away in the washroom. How can you do this for him? What choice I got? The man snapped. I don't do it, my family starves. Pretend you didn't hear nothing, I'm going in. He started toward the washroom. Clara's mind raced, panic clawing at her. She didn't know what to do. Then, out of nowhere, a voice whispered in her ear, hide in the cellar now. Clara whipped around, no one there. But survival trumped fear. She darted to the little trapdoor by the washroom, slipping into the cellar. She eased the door shut just as the hired hand's boots thumped closer. Peering through the dim moonlight spilling from a vent, she froze. A shadowy figure stood in the cellar with her. Was this a trap? But then the figure turned. "Clara, don't be scared. I'm here to save you." It was a handsome stranger, his voice soft and steady. Clara stared, half shocked, half relieved. She stumbled toward the stranger. "Thank you, mister," she said, her voice shaky. But just then, the hired hand started banging around outside. Clara's kind heart kicked in. "I've dragged you into this. When you get a chance, run for it." Right then, a bird fluttered in through the cellar vent. In a blink, it turned into a beautiful young woman. "Close your eyes, both of you," she said. "I'll get you out. Leave those two upstairs to me, I'm gonna make 'em pay." Clara and the stranger shut their eyes tight. Next thing they knew, they were in a cozy cabin. The man lit a candle and turned to Clara. "This is my place," he said. "You're safe here, no one's coming after you. Do you remember me?" Clara squinted at him, then gasped. "Wait, Johnny? Johnny Boone? How'd you end up here? And that girl, the one who was a bird, what's going on? Is she in danger?" Johnny nodded with a grin. Turns out, Johnny Boone grew up in the hollow next to Clara's old village. His pa was a schoolteacher, hired by the local folks to teach reading and sums. Johnny's dad had big dreams of passing the state exams and making a name for himself. But after failing one too many times, he fell ill and passed away. Left behind Johnny and his ma, Widow Boone, to fend for themselves. They struggled hard, barely enough food for one meal a day. Johnny took to chopping wood and gathering fodder just to scrape by. Clara knew a bit of their story and felt for him. One day, when she was bringing lunch to her pa in the woods, she slipped into a ditch. Johnny happened by and pulled her out. After that, they got friendly. Clara didn't just pity Johnny, she owed him one. From then on, when she'd haul food up to her pa, she'd pack extra. She'd say it was to eat with her dad, but really, it was for Johnny if she ran into him. She'd rather go hungry herself than let him starve. One time, Clara found Johnny alone, ting in the dirt, tears streaming down his face. She rushed over. "What's wrong?" He pointed to a little bird on the ground. "Annie's dead. Found her hurt in the woods a month back. Took her home, nursed her, called her Annie. She perked up at first, ate, drank, even flew a little. Nights when I'd read by the fire, she'd sit with me. But a couple days ago, she stopped eating, stopped moving. Thought maybe she belonged back in the wild, so I brought her here to let her go. Now she's gone for good." Clara saw how torn up he was and felt it too. "Maybe Annie's like us," she said. "Her time was up. Don't be too sad. How about we bury her proper?" Johnny nodded. Together, they found a sunny spot on the hillside, dug a small grave, and laid Annie to rest with a little mound of dirt. Not long after, Johnny's ma took him to the county seat to live with kin. Clara never saw him again. She moped about it for a while. Then the flood hit her village, and her rough road began. Now, here they were, face to face again. Clara couldn't help worrying about the bird girl. That bird turning into a lady, was that Annie, the one we buried? Is she gonna be okay? Johnny nodded firm. "Annie's fine, I promise." Clara frowned, curious. "How can you be so sure?" Johnny took a breath and started to explain. Johnny settled back, his voice steady. "That girl you saw? That's Annie, the same bird we buried. She's got some kind of magic in her. Way back when, she was trying to cross some big hurdle in her practice, whatever spirits do. She messed up, lost her strength, and crashed to earth. A pack of wild dogs was after her when I stumbled across her chopping wood. I shooed him off and took her home to patch her up. But that magic she lost? It don't come back easy. Her days were numbered. After she passed, we buried her like you said. That spot we picked, it's got a special energy, a lucky patch of ground. Because you and me put her there, it brought us a bit of that luck too. Funny thing is, Levi Stone was roaming the hills that day. He tripped over Annie's little grave and figured out it was something special. Dug her up, tossed her aside, and started hunting for folks willing to pay, or trade, for his fortune-fixing tricks. That's how he ran into Frank Wheeler. Johnny paused, then went on. But Annie, she'd soaked up some of that spot's power. It brought her back, busted right out of the dirt. She kept practicing, learned to shift into a human shape. Came looking for me 'cause I saved her, and you 'cause you buried her. When she saw you were headed for a saloon life, she worked a spell, put that mark on your face to scare him off. Saved you from that fate. But here's the twist, Annie knew there was something between us, even back then. And all those nights she perched by me while I read? She caught feelings. Wanted a life with me herself. Figured if she kept us apart, she'd have a shot. After helping you that once, she reckoned her debt was paid and left you be. Clara's eyes widened, piecing it together. Johnny kept going. Thing is, Annie didn't count on me. I never forgot you, used to call your name in my sleep. They say real love's about letting go, right? So Annie started keeping tabs on you again. She figured out you were in trouble and wanted to settle the score with Levi and Frank. Plus, she wanted to test me, see how deep I felt for you. Told me where you were. I lit up like a firecracker, but she warned me your face was marked now, uglier than a mud fence. Didn't faze me one bit, I just wanted to see you. When I heard you were in danger, I begged her to help me save you. She said she could sneak me into that cellar, but if they caught us, it'd be curtains. I didn't care, told her yes in a heartbeat. Clara's throat tightened, tears prickling her eyes. Who'd have thought burying a bird would unravel all this? That Johnny'd hold onto her memory so fierce, risk his neck to pull her out of the fire? She remembered how blue she'd been when he left without a word. Her cheeks flushed, but then she caught herself, that ugly mark still on her face. She ducked her head, ashamed. The room went quiet, a stillness heavier than words. Both of them fretted over Annie though, human hearts can be wicked, and Levi knew tricks. Just then, Annie popped into the cabin, safe and sound. Clara and Johnny jumped up, hollering, "What happened?" Annie's eyes flickered with a hint of sadness, seeing how in sync they were. But she brushed it off. Used a bit of magic, she said. Whipped up a straw dummy in the cellar, made it look like Clara. That hired hand busted in, grabbed it, and hauled it to Levi. Levi started his ritual, but I turned the tables, spelled the town marshal to show up just in time. Caught Levi and Frank red-handed. They're both locked up now, getting what they deserve. Clara and Johnny beamed, tears welling up. I've lingered here too long, Annie said. Gotta head back to the deep woods, keep up my practice. Our paths split here. Be happy, you two. With a wave, she vanished. As she went, the mark on Clara's face faded clean away, leaving her pretty as ever. Clara stayed on at Johnny's cabin after that. She pitched in, looking after Widow Boone, Johnny's ma, with a gentle hand. She'd sit with Johnny by the window on cold nights, him reading by candlelight, her cheering him on. It wasn't long before they tied the knot. They were a pair who'd weather anything together, raising a passel of kids with love. They taught him to honor their elders, same as they did. A few years down the line, Johnny buckled down and studied hard. He aced the state exams, landed a job as a local official. Did right by the folks in town, racking up praise for his fair dealings. Rose through the ranks, 3 promotions in all. Clara, by his side, got herself a title too. Folks called her Mrs. Boone with respect. Both of them never forgot Annie though. They'd think of her often, grateful for what she'd done. Well folks, that wraps up our first tale. Now, I'll spin you another one, Nancy Miller's next yarn. Don't miss it. I reckon it'll hook you from the get-go. The second story's an old American folk tale called The Girl Who Loved Her Brother's Wife. She gave her all, but got nothing but grief in return. A feud from a past life settled at last. Way back in colonial times, say the 1750s, in a little trading post called Willow Creek, down in Virginia, lived a girl named Lucy Carter. Her family was well off, part of the town's big shots. They owned 100 acres of prime farmland and ran a couple of stores. Her pa, Tom Carter, and her ma, Martha, kept things humming. Her big brother, Will, was 10 years older. He'd married a gal named Sarah and had a boy, little Jimmy. 6 of them in that house, living high and happy. But when Lucy hit 10, things fell apart fast. First, Martha took sick and passed. Then Will, who loved a good card game, got roped into a rigged match. Some sharp cheated him out of everything. Family went broke overnight. All they had left was one rickety general store to keep them afloat. Tom couldn't take it, losing his wife, then watching Will gamble away their fortune. The shock hit him hard, he had a stroke, half his body quit on him. He didn't last long after that. Folks say a brother's like a father, a sister-in-law's like a mother. Everyone figured Will and Sarah would step up for young Lucy. But from then on, Sarah turned mean, laying into Lucy for every little thing. Will was a pushover, scared stiff of his wife. Plus, that last store they clung to? It was Sarah's dowry, gave her all the say. So Will bent to her every whim, no questions asked. With no hired help left, Sarah wasn't used to lifting a finger. She made Lucy the maid of the house. Poor Lucy didn't just cook and clean, she hauled water, chopped wood, and toted little Jimmy around too. If Sarah wasn't happy, she'd wallop Lucy good. Will wanted to shield his sister, but he'd just end up catching a beating alongside her. Even so, Will couldn't kick his gambling habit. He'd sneak out and beg Lucy to cover for him, lie to Sarah's face. One morning, Will stumbled home at dawn after a night at the tables. Lucy had breakfast ready and called Sarah to eat. Sarah noticed Will was missing and stormed to the front room. She found a pair of dice on the floor, knew he'd been at it again. Will blurted out he'd come home early, just slept in the parlor to not wake her and Jimmy. He nudged Lucy to back him up. Lucy wasn't one to fib, but she saw how Sarah lit into Will. She felt for him. Yeah, he got in early, she said. Sarah didn't buy it. She hauled off and slapped Lucy hard across the face. Lucy's ears rang, but she held it together. Will shrank back, too scared to speak up. Instead, he pointed at Lucy. She told me to say it. Lucy felt the sting of betrayal, her cheek burning from Sarah's hand. She bit back tears, refusing to break. Sarah, though, started bawling. I must have cursed 8 lifetimes to end up like this, she wailed. Thought marrying into the Carters meant an easy life. Now I'm stuck with you two ganging up on me every day. How am I supposed to live like this? Will scrambled to calm her down. Lucy, take Jimmy outside to play, he muttered. Poor Lucy bundled up little Jimmy on her back, grabbed a basket of laundry, and trudged to the creek. She set to scrubbing clothes by the water's edge. Hadn't been there long when some rowdy kids her age showed up. They started chucking rocks at her, laughing. Look at her hauling Jimmy like a pack mule, they jeered. Lucy, sweet as she was, didn't snap back. Lucky for her, a boy 3 years older, Jake Miller, stepped in. He chased off the brats, giving Em a stern talking to. Don't you mess with Lucy again, or you'll answer to me, he warned. Lucy often wished Will could be more like Jake, hardworking, dependable, someone to lean on. If Will cared half as much as Jake did, maybe Sarah wouldn't ride her so hard. Jake became her best pal after that. Sometimes she'd daydream about growing up and marrying him, getting out of that miserable house. It showed just how tough things were for her at home. While Lucy was lost in thought, a cry rang out from the creek. She looked up from her washing. A village kid had fallen in, flailing in the water. Lucy bolted over, yelling for help, hoping some grown-up would hear. She hollered till her throat was raw, but no one came. Saving him was up to her. She set Jimmy down safe on the bank. Stay put, little man, she said. Then she waded into the creek. Good thing it wasn't deep. She dragged the boy out, soaked but safe. The other kids who'd been playing nearby saw it all. They crowded around, wide-eyed, calling her brave. From then on, they quit picking on her. But here's what burned her up. When she got home with Jimmy and the clean laundry, Sarah grabbed her by the arm and lit into her. Seems Sarah's new dress had gone missing. Plus, she was mad Lucy left Jimmy alone by the creek. Lucy tried to explain. I was saving that boy. The clothes were right there by the water. I didn't notice the dress float off, 'cause I was pulling him out. Sarah wouldn't hear it. She chased Lucy around the yard, swinging. Will watched but didn't lift a finger to stop her. Thankfully, the drowned boy's folks showed up just then. They carried 2 fat hens as a thank you, trailed by a gaggle of village kids vouching for Lucy's story. Sarah realized she got it wrong, but her eyes narrowed quick. She turned it around, asking the boy's parents to pay for her lost dress. Supposed to be pricey, she sniffed. 2 hens don't cut it. The parents nodded, figuring it was fair. We'll fetch 2 more later, they said. But Lucy piped up, good-hearted as ever. I saved him, 'cause it was right. You don't owe us nothing, keep them hens. Sarah spun on her, yanking her close and pinching her arm hard. Lucy swallowed the pain, staying quiet. Sarah snatched the 2 hens anyway, then barked orders. Will, you're with me at the store. Lucy, mind Jimmy, clean the house inside and out, and cook them birds for lunch. We'll eat when we're back. In that house, only Jimmy brought Lucy any comfort. When he'd call her auntie, her heart warmed. Cute little guy gave her something to smile about. Lunchtime rolled around, and Sarah wouldn't let Lucy touch the chicken. Will grinned, picking at his plate. If it weren't for Lucy, we wouldn't even have this bird. Sarah scowled. Her eating it's a waste. Even little Jimmy tried sneaking Lucy a drumstick, but Sarah snatched it back. She swatted Jimmy too, making him cry. Lucy scooped him up and hushed him quiet, rocking him off to the side. A few years went by. Will eased up on the gambling, thanks to Sarah keeping him on a tight leash. Home life got a smidge better than before. Jimmy hit 7, old enough for school. Lucy, now 14, had grown into a graceful young lady. Her childhood pal Jake Miller, 17, filled out too, a strapping handsome fella. He worked at a grain shop in town. Those years, Jake had been a lifeline for Lucy, helping her chop wood, tote water, all the heavy stuff. His kind words kept her going. Without him, she might have buckled under the weight. Jake hated seeing Lucy suffer. He'd been itching to get her out of that mess for a while. By colonial law, girls could marry at 14, fellas at 16. Jake figured it was time. He talked to his folks, who knew Lucy was a rare catch, good and true. They sent a matchmaker to the Carter's place to propose. But Sarah wasn't one to let opportunity slip. Seeing Lucy blossom into something prettier than she'd ever been, Sarah smelled a payday. She demanded a bride price of $100, steep as a mountain. And that wasn't all. Whoever coughs up that much gets her, she declared. Lucy fumed, but what could she do? Argue, and she'd just get whacked again. Will, useless as ever, backed Sarah's scheme. Raised her all these years, he mumbled. She owes us. Jake, a grain shop hand, couldn't fathom that kind of cash. But he wouldn't give up. Wait for me, Lucy, he said. I'll make it work. He quit the shop, left Willow Creek, and headed to the city to learn a trade. Months later, Sarah had to visit her folks, taking Jimmy along. For Will, it was a golden chance to slack off. He told Lucy he was off to restock the store, leaving her to mind it. Truth was, he rummaged through Sarah's things, found $3 she'd stashed, and hightailed it to the gambling den with some roughnecks. Not only did he lose it all, he borrowed $50 from a lowlife named Tommy Three Fingers, and lost that too.
That night, Sarah got home and found the money gone.
She grabbed a broom and started swinging at Will. Where's it at?
Gambling again, who?
Will lied through his teeth.
Nope, not me.
Then he turned on Lucy. Bet she took it, saving up to run off with Jake. Sarah didn't bother sorting truth from trash. She laid into Lucy fierce, bruising her up bad. Lucy's heart broke. This house was a prison, she couldn't stay. She planned to slip out that night, head to the county seat, and find Jake. Maybe get a job, anything beat this torment. But she'd underestimated Sarah's cold streak. That evening, Tommy Three Fingers showed up, pounding on the door. Sarah knew Lucy wasn't the thief, but instead of guilt, she cursed her out. You weren't here watching Will, she shrieked. Let him sneak off and blow our cash. Now we're in debt up to our necks. Tommy didn't care who was to blame, he wanted his money. Pay up, or I'm taking the store, he growled. That had got their last lifeline. Sarah sobbed like the world was ending. Why'd I get saddled with this fool? Years ago he gambled us broke, left me with just my dowry store. Now that's gone too. Jimmy huddled in Lucy's arms, scared stiff. Will groveled, begging Tommy for 10 more days. Tommy sneered.
Fedes, Maybe, if you take 2 fingers first.
Tommy's real game wasn't just the money. He'd had his eye on Lucy's beauty for a while. Sarah's $100 price tag was too rich for him, so he cooked up this debt trap instead. He leered at Lucy, laying it out plain. Will grabbed her arm, pulling her back, and dropped to his knees in front of her. He banged his head on the floor like a hammer. Lucy, I'm your brother, your closest kin.
How can you let me suffer like this?
If the store's gone, me, Sarah, and Jimmy are sunk. You're marrying somebody either way, why's it gotta be Jake? Sarah, seeing Tommy held all the cards, complete with Will's signed AOU, joined in the pleading. Lucy wept, her voice choked. She'd been set to run to Jake that night, but now she was cornered.
Tommy Scoons blocked the door.
Suddenly, Lucy wrenched free from Will's grip. She ran straight for a wooden post in the room and slammed her head into it. Blood poured out, staining a chair red. The room went still, shocked gasps all around. Jimmy clung to his aunt, sobbing his heart out. A life was lost, but Tommy didn't flinch. Wasn't his doing, Will and Sarah pushed her to it. He kept the pressure on. Store's mine, or else. Will and Sarah tried the law, hauling it to the magistrate. But everyone, Jimmy included, said Lucy did it to herself.
Case closed quick, no charges stuck.
Will and Sarah started feeling the weight of what they'd done. Forcing Lucy to her end wasn't something to brag about. They figured on burying her simple and quiet. But thinking back on Lucy's years in that house, especially how she doted on Jimmy, they couldn't bear it. Sarah went to her folks, borrowed $5, and planned to buy a decent coffin. Will was about to head out for it, but Sarah worried he'd gamble the cash away. She decided to take Jimmy and go herself. Jimmy, still torn up over losing his auntie, moped along. Just as they were set to leave, he piped up. "Ma pa, I saw auntie's hand move."
She ain't dead.
Will and Sarah froze, spooked. Lucy'd been laid out 2 days and nights. They peeked at her, half expecting a ghost. Sure enough, her eyes fluttered open, she was breathing shallow. They'd thought her gone for good. They dropped to their knees, begging her not to haunt him. Right then, a traveling preacher drifted in, calm as you please. "Peace be with you, folks," he said.
No need to fret, Lucy ain't dead.
Will and Sarah clutched at hope, but they weren't sold. They begged the preacher to shield them from her spirit. He just smiled and dropped a truth that knocked him cold. In her last life, Lucy was a rich man's wife, he said. Will, you were her stable hand. Sarah, you were her maid. You two fell for each other and asked her to set you free. She said sure, if you could scrape together $100 to buy your liberty. A maid and a stable hand couldn't dream of that kind of coin. So you ran off together, got caught, and ended up drowned in the river, locked in a cage. After, you begged the heavens for a chance to settle the score with her in this life. Will and Sarah, you got reborn into a good family cause of your hard lot before. Fell for each other at first sight, hitched up. That's why, no matter how low Will sank, Sarah never walked out, couldn't bear to. 10 years after you passed in that old life, Lucy came back as Will's little sister. Then Will tanked the family, and she ended up like a servant, paying for her past. Will and Sarah sat there, dumbstruck.
The priachas wird's rang to tru to dupt.
Sarah snapped out of it first.
Priacha, she said, I don't wanna life like this no more.
I can't stop myself. Every time I see Lucy, I want to yell at her, hit her, make her hurt. But I just want me, Will, and Jimmy to have a good life. Will's a mess, sure, but I can't leave him. Even with the store, my dowry, I could have walked away, but I didn't. I don't want this hate. Help us fix it, please. Will chimed in, voice shaky. Preacher, I try to stand up for Lucy when Sarah's on her. I want to protect her, but I ain't got the guts. Sometimes, seeing her get it makes me feel good inside, like I'm even. And the gambling, I don't want to do it, but I keep sliding back. Help us, I'm begging. The preacher didn't answer right off. He turned to Lucy instead. She spoke up, soft but sure. Preacher, if what you say's true, I messed up bad in that last life. No wonder I couldn't get free of this house. I owed him something. Kept thinking I'd leave, but I'd die trying instead. Was it you who saved me?
Verbselon de Jubota. The priacha seid.
I was there in that old life too. I'm the one who found Will and Sarah running off, caught him for your husband. After they drowned, I felt the guilt. Took up wandering with my teacher, a holy man, looking for peace. He told me my debts from back then weren't settled. I worked hard, prayed harder, till I saw the whole story clear. Found you three and knew I had to tell it. Wasn't sure you'd believe me. That day you crashed into the post, I was watching, kept you from crossing over. As for fixing this? Here's the only way I know, like the good book says, treat folks like they're your own kin from days gone by. No two sets of parents, just one family. Let go of the grudge when it flares up. See each other as blood, not enemies. You've got this chance to be kin, brother, sister-in-law, husband, wife.
Life's a life you want, or you will drown in hate forever. You will suffer, and so will your boy.
Will and Sarah listened, and it hit him hard. All the times they'd lashed out at Lucy came rushing back. They broke down, begging her forgiveness. Lucy, knowing what she'd done before, asked the same of them. They took that $5 meant for her coffin and bought lumber instead. Rented a storefront, fixed up the old general store, and got it running again. Word went out to Jake in the city. He came tearing back to Willow Creek. Finally, he and Lucy could be together. From then on, both families patched things up. Will stepped up as a brother, a husband, a pa. Sarah and Lucy turned into sisters, thick as thieves.
Jake and Lucy built a marriage full of love.
They all rolled up their sleeves, working hard to carve out a future. Will turned himself around, quit the cards for good. He and Sarah had 2 more kids, a boy and a girl.
Jake and Lucy raised a son and 2 daughters. The Carters and the Millers great ticht. Bigger and stronger than tight ever been back in the glory days.
Jimmy studied hard, made the honor roll, and grew up to be a town official himself. This tale's an old folk yarn, meant to nudge folks toward good and away from bad. It's about holding on to what's right, not superstition. Thanks for listening, y'all. Drop a comment if you're moved. It's like they say, no bad blood, no crossing paths. From Lucy and her kin, we learn helping others helps you too. Hate just tears everyone down, but letting it go brings blessings back your way. Do good, build up grace, and good'll come to you.
What do you reckon?
Well folks, that's the end of the tale. If you liked what I shared, drop a line below. I'd love to hear from you. Give a thumbs up and pass it along if it struck a chord. Thanks for tuning in.
See you next time with another story. I'll be waiting.